Transnet has asked government for financial assistance to pay its 130 billion rand debt, while in July, Eskom received a 16 billion rand payment from National Treasury. Now, the amount received by Eskom is part of the 254 billion rand that the power utility stands to receive in order to pay a big portion of its total debt load of 423 billion rand. The same has been the case with most of South Africa's big state-owned companies over the years. That includes, of course, SAA, the SABC, and others. And while these SOEs were positioned to spearhead the country's economic development by promoting industrial competitiveness and social development that includes growing new skills and employment, it remains to be seen, though, what or whether that ambition can still be realized. So joining us for the discussion now, we have Dawie Roodt, who's the founder and director, Chief Economist of the Efficient Group, and former South African Statistician-General, Dr. Pali Lehohla, both joining us virtually. Gentlemen, absolute pleasure having you here with us this morning. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning, Zach. Morning, Dawie.
We hear now that Transnet is asking government to take on a portion of its debt. No surprises, because when this was done for Eskom, of course the other SOEs would be expected to ask for the same. Would that be fair to assert, Dawie?
Yeah, maybe a good starting point is just to point out that the national government's debt level has reached really alarming high levels. The fiscal deficit of the Minister of Finance is probably going to get close to about 6% of GDP this year. So, of course, everybody is going to the Minister of Finance and asking for more money, but the reality is the Minister of Finance is in very deep trouble as well. Now, if you put all the state-owned enterprises and their debt together, then I'm afraid the pressure on the national government will really be so huge that we are heading for a financial crisis. And that's what I'm very concerned about. It is not only Transnet or not only Eskom. It is also the local authorities. It's also the post office. It's also the NELs. All those things together. And it's also the national government's fiscal position that's become untenable as well. So yes, I'm afraid the problems are simply getting bigger by the day, and the government is simply not, I think, not recognizing the danger and the troubles in which we are in.
So if we look at what's happening with the SOEs, Dr. Lehohla, and of course, what is being asked by Transnet at the moment, is that likely to change the situation? Because we've seen a lot of good money being thrown after bad, really, with regard to SOEs. And as the South African public, one has to ask whether there's any real good return on investment in terms of how government is spending.
Well, I think under the current circumstances, we are heading for disaster, and there is no end in sight. And the bailouts are not really the solution. There is something much more fundamental that has to happen to the SOEs than throwing money at them. At the current rate and with the current architecture of conception of the SOEs, there is something fundamentally wrong. I mean, we like the word SOEs as we like the word NDP. But what it takes to run the NDP, what it takes to run the SOEs, what it takes to deal with poverty is far from what is expected and what is the practice in countries that are serious about development. Ours is a joke, unfortunately.
So what is wrong with our SOEs and how do we go about fixing it? Dawie, you can have the first bite.
Yeah, well, the answer is quite easy to understand, is that we've got a government that is just not up to the task. We've got a government with a certain ideological stance. We've got a government that is quite often incompetent. Let's call a spade a spade. And we've got a government that's quite often corrupt as well. So we know how to fix these problems. We know how to fix our economic problems in South Africa. The reality is that our political leaders are just not good quality leaders. That is the reality. And until we fix our political problems, we will not fix the economic problems in South Africa. It's not only the SOEs, it goes for the local authorities, it goes for many other macroeconomic policies that are currently in place. But the major issue that we have in South Africa is a leadership issue. We need to fix that.
Dr. Lehohla, do you agree with that? And also the issue of ideology takes us back to why these SOEs were established to begin with. But what's your take on it?
Well, I think we can't talk about leadership. We have people in the position of leadership. that are very weak. We don't have leadership. It is a misnomer to call what we have leadership. Certainly not. It doesn't have the ideological stamina to follow through with the ideology. They talk left, they act right. So it's a schizophrenic kind of situation where there is no follow through with what is demanded of a particular posture, which is economic. And therefore, it's a whole mess. I mean, we have followed Milton Friedman's fundamentalist, free market fundamentalism, but it's one which is absolutely not even that Milton Friedman's fundamentalism. Neither have we followed a mixed economy kind of socialist orientation. So it's a mixed masala that you can't understand what it is. Intellectually, the leadership is the people who are in position of leadership is bankrupt in terms of what are economic policies that work together to lead to a particular outcome. So we have all these things called master plans. We have all these things that are called economic recovery and reconstruction plan. We have all these things called district development model. When you read through those, there is nothing technically competent in assembling those to lead to a particular outcome.
Can I add to that,
So
Sakina?
this is the problem.
Go ahead, Dawie.
Yes, okay. Dr. Lehohla mentioned ideology here, and he mentioned that they're talking left but acting right. I slightly disagree with you, Pali. And the reason why I say so is that I think ideologically the ANC government is pretty much a left-leaning government. They're a socialist government. They call each other comrades. They call the South African state a developmental state. They try to take more and more control over more and more things. There are many examples of that. But the reality is that although they are left-leaning, a socialist kind of government that we have in South Africa, the reality is that what quite often happens is that more right-leaning things happen. And the reason why more right-leaning things happen is because they are just not capable of implementing all even left-leaning policies or ideologies. A very good example is that it's not official policy for the ANC or for government to privatize anything in South Africa. But in reality, what happens, because they are so incompetent and inefficient in running the state-owned enterprises, as an example, is that many of these state-owned enterprises are, for all practical purposes, being privatized. A very good example is currently what's happening to the post office. The post office is simply coming to an end. What is happening to Eskom is that the private sector is generating electricity more so. So that is the irony here, that we've got a left-leaning government ideologically, but in practice what happens is that many of these state-owned enterprises are being privatized to a large extent. So from that point of view, I disagree with you. I think we certainly do have a left-leaning government, but in practice something else happens.
Dawie, I don't believe that we disagree. We actually agree that we have a left-leaning talk, but a right-acting government. So there is a schizophrenic and a schizophrenia, and that is the origins of this are that the ideology is not pursued and followed through socialist policies. It's socialist talk, and because of this ambiguity of a developmental state, you don't see development coming through. I mean, if you take the apartheid state, it was a developmental state of a special kind that excluded blacks. But when you look at what they pursued development to the T, using the SOEs, from the architecture of the SOEs, funding them well, ensuring that they are led by scientists and competent people, and engaging and mitigating the force of capital by the SOEs through training, through everything. If you had somebody who trained at Eskom, you would have actually mitigated the employment of such a person in the private sector, whichever sector. Once they knew he worked for Eskom, or they knew he worked or trained as Eskom or Transnet, they were able to move from training into work straight up. What we have at the moment with our sitters, me as Lehohla, comes with a small a briefcase and say, I can run a sitter. With what capacity? And everybody is given the sitter status, and what comes out of that is something else that is not employable, that cannot contribute to any economy, and the money is piling up there in the sitters. And what happened? Brown used it to go and play the Johannesburg Stock Exchange or other stock exchanges with that. This
Yeah.
is the kind of mess we have in this country.
Yes, and I do not disagree with you. I do not disagree with you. But what the reality is, whether we like that or not, the reality is that we've got a government that's not good at running these sort of things. And the reality is that the private sector is taking over many of these functions. So should we not perhaps position ourselves where we accept reality and try to manage that in a manner that is less damaging to what is currently happening? A very good example is, like, for example, the private sector was not allowed to generate electricity for 10 megawatts and then 50 or whatever the case. And eventually, inevitably, the private sector now is allowed to generate electricity. Why did it take so long before we accept that the private sector is going to generate electricity? Because inevitably, that is what's going to happen. The same is happening with the post office. The private sector is not allowed to transport or to deliver letters, as an example. But in reality, the post office is coming to an end. So why don't we accept the private sector and doing these kind of functions instead of fighting the private sector and preventing the private sector to doing what they inevitably are going to do and doing in any way in a practical sense?
So all of that, of course, plays out in a context in a country that is perhaps one of the most, if not the most unequal in the world, where poverty is rife, where unemployment is at unacceptably high levels. So with that in mind, given what's happening with the SOEs, what kind of reset button does government now need to press? You know, is it worthwhile to keep bailing out these state-owned entities, or is it worthwhile, as Dawie points out, Dr. Lehohla, to basically just privatize? And what does that mean for these South Africans who are just reeling in poverty?
Well, going privatization is not the right route. But free market enterprise is chaos. But we don't have a government that is capable of doing anything about that. And a reset is certainly one where, and I think we had an opportunity for a reset, where business approached government at the onset of COVID. Business came there, and it came with very clear targets. I don't think those targets were achievable in terms of the plan that was on the table, because there was no path towards achieving those. But there were very, very important targets where business was saying we can lower unemployment to 15%. We can grow this economy at 6%. We have this bag of programs and projects that we think we should pursue. A government that is intelligent, that has capacity, that has an NDP, would have agreed with business on the basis of what the NDP said. But it would step back and say, how do we achieve this? Show us the path towards achieving this. Let us discuss and make sure that we achieve these goals, because they are noble goals. But an incompetent government, which could not even assemble what the private sector was coming with, let the private sector off the hook. And now the private sector came to the oracle later with 3 projects, and they were given 3 projects: rail, transport, in terms of Transnet, and crime. The next time they come, they'll come out with nothing, because there'll be nothing left in that space, because the government is just simply incompetent to try and assemble what a developmental state should do and can achieve. The architecture is in the wrong hands, absolutely in the wrong hands.
Can I react to that, please, Akinam?
Go for it.
And that is, let's just see. Pali, I must disagree with you here. Let's see if the private sector is chaos. Let's see what the private sector provides, and let's see what the state provides, and let's see where the chaos is. Can we get food in South Africa? Yes, it's provided by the private sector. Can you get all sort of jobs? Can you get the electrician in South Africa? Can you get a plumber in South Africa, or a builder in South Africa? Can you get all those sort of things? And the answer is yes. You can get every time. If you want to buy clothes, it's there. The state is not providing any of that. But can you get electricity? Can you get good policemen in South Africa? Can you get good civil servants in South Africa? Can you get roads without potholes? Can you get those? And the answer is no, you cannot get those. Why? Because it's provided by the state. But it doesn't mean the state doesn't have a job. If you really want to do something about unemployment and poverty in South Africa, the state must provide a world-class skills development system. The state must provide safety, because you cannot start a small business if you can't do it in a safe environment. That's the job of the state. They must do that. They must make sure that we have water in our taps. jobs. That's the job of the state, not to deliver or to fly airlines, not even to...
No, I agree with you, Dawie. I think, SAA as a flag of the nation, it's nice to have a flag there, but let those things be right. I don't think a government can go and manufacture cars. That would be absolutely fundamentally wrong to try and deal with those things that have actually matured into the private sector. But electricity, that is power, safety, water, transport, all those are things that have to be provided by the state as a serious monopoly that thinks business that is capable. But with the lot that we have, nothing like that can happen. With the pensions that we have, 2.3 trillion, I mean, our economic policies are so bad that we go and borrow from the markets. The developed nations borrow from their pensions. They don't borrow from the market. South Africa is sitting on 20 trillion rands that can solve the problems of, in terms of financing, problems of Eskom, problems of Transnet. All those problems can be financed as of today. But unfortunately, no one in their right senses can entrust borrowing from those monies with the current crop that is so corrupt, because then that will be drained. So let's confront the incompetence of what people who are in leadership who actually have no qualities of leadership at all. That's what the evil we should confront. That is the evil we should confront, so that we can borrow from our pensions with the confidence that that money will be back and we can reinvest in South Africa all the time. This is the economic policies that we have that are in the wrong hands, economic policies that are wrong. And the main thing is we don't have trust in these people that actually deserve no trust. They've proven again and again that they don't
But Pali, but that is not correct. That's not correct. A lot of money is being borrowed from the pension funds. In fact, that is one of the most important assets for pension funds. They lend money to the state. They used to lend money to Eskom as well, and they used to lend money to the NEL as well. They're not anymore, but the state is the biggest borrower in the country, and they borrow from pension funds. They borrow from insurers. They borrow from banks. That's where the state get the money from.
All right, well, as we round this up.
Pension funds, that's what we have to do. Eskom must borrow from the state, other than borrow from the private markets in terms of its recapitalization. Surely it should have borrowed from, just as Bail asked for 16 million from Smarts right at the beginning and built Eskom.
Okay, your closing sentiments for us, Dawie, but I also want to touch on the skills development issue and looking at SOEs. Are these not the perfect sites, that could be used to upskill and empower the nation, so to speak?
Skills development, yeah. Skills development, without a doubt, is the single most important thing that the state can do. But before we can even do that, more importantly is that the state's responsibility is to create a safe environment for everybody in the country. That should be the starting point.
Dr. Lehohla?
Indeed, Dawie is correct. The fact that we have privatized, the fact that we have gambled with our education in the way we have is deplorable. That you actually find that we have somebody competing with me on the line. I would not mind if it's Dawie, but yes. But the fact that Mesakina, you find that in 1980, in the 70s, for every one black person who graduated, there were 1.2 whites who did as a proportion of their own population. And by 2016, we find that for every one black person who graduates, there are 6 white people who graduate as a proportion of their own population, which doesn't show white better performance, but black deplorable performance. Is something that the governments successively have not followed to realize that there is destruction of human resources continuously in South Africa. We are in that state where now education is being privatized, and we don't have a skills base that Eskom, Transnet, and all these SOEs, as a matter of course, were actually producing for the nation. We went into the SETAs, and that destroyed the capability. We closed the nursing schools, we closed the teacher training schools. Now, the nurses speak English to the wounds. The teachers speak nothing to the children. The third thing that I think we are actually not realizing is that our young people are destroyed at birth, and teachers face a situation as social workers, as nation builders, as everything, and we hardly have empathy for them. And as a nation that is at a level of crisis that we are, we actually have to start thinking about the empathy we must have towards teachers who carry the burden of trying to build a country that doesn't have leadership.
Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it. But thanks so much. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Unfortunately, Dawie had to leave there. But former Statistician-General Dr. Pali Lehohla and Director and Chief Economist of the Efficient Group, Dawie Roodt, in conversation with us. They were sharing their views on the peculiar case of South Africa's state-owned entities and that continue, of course, to receive the government's financial assistance. And this despite a track record of dismal performance and seemingly hardly any good return on investment.